Okay, if stragglers at the back, that means you, Marta, could take their seats. So, on behalf of the organizing committee of the Conference on Baltic Studies in Europe, the 12th conference, 2017, I'd like to greet you. I'm so happy that there are so many familiar faces here, people who've traveled from North America, from around Europe to come to our conference. This is the opening plenary. We have some words of welcome, followed by our keynote address from Dr. Matisa, and then we'll be moving on to the Latvian National Museum of Art, where we have a reception which is hosted by the Riga Municipal Authority. But without further ado, I'd like to give the first welcoming words to my boss, so I expect a big round of applause from everybody. My job probably lies on this. The rector of the University of Latvia, Professor Indričs Muižnieks.
So, hello everybody, and thank you, Professor Auers, for organizing the applause for me. But honestly speaking, I'm really pleased and honored to welcome all of you here at the 12th Conference of Baltic Studies in Europe. And it's a special occasion for the university to host this conference in our premises, since many of our countries, Baltic countries, are celebrating or will be celebrating their 100th years anniversaries in the forthcoming year. Finland is celebrating already this year. And our university is very much linked to the history of our country, and probably, as you see here from the name of the University of Latvia, it's one of the few universities in the world which is named not after the city where it is located, but after the country. And it has a very good reason, and this reason is hidden also in the walls of this building, because the building where the university is located and where we shall celebrate our 100th anniversary in 2019 is older than the university itself. Actually, it is a building which initially was intended for the Riga Polytechnical Institute, and our local alma mater university for the citizens of Latvia or of the provinces which later formed Latvia on the basis of the ruins of Tsarist Empire, were in Tartu, because at that time we was in one province of the empire, and Riga was the industrial heart of this part of the country. And the university, as usually, especially in Hanseatic cities, was not very warm welcomed. It was deemed to be rather the source of different irregularities, of different new ideas, which not always are supportive for the development of trade, commerce, and industries. And that's why the practically minded citizens of Riga decided to refuse starting up the university to Gustav Adolf, to Stefan Batory, to Alexander I, and only when the independence of the country was established in 1918, also the university was created as the part and parcel of national independence, of national state. And you know, Latvians are proud of many famous opera artists like Egils Siliņš or Anita Garanča or and many of others around today. But one of them, of their predecessors in 1919, so on the day when the university was founded, Maris Vētra, said that only when the university was founded with the society in Latvia and in Riga had the feeling that the process of establishment of Latvian state has been complete and now finished. And that's why our university has always been very deeply involved in the development of our country. Our slogan says, you see it here on the wall, Scientia Patria. This means for science and fatherland. And although it may seem some contradiction hidden in this slogan, because science is international and what we are doing for our fatherland, it's very closely linked to the national interests, to the national developments, national culture, national languages. But in fact, this is the only way how it works. If we are not being able to present and to compete with our neighboring countries, with our neighboring universities, if we are not contributing to the development of science in the broader sense of this word, if we are not creating the basis of our competitiveness through the research and technology transfers, then we are not worth for our country, and we are always being keen to combine all those activities in the daily work of our university. And nowadays, our university probably is the largest research organization in Latvia, comprising not only teaching but also research in vast variety of fields. It is a comprehensive university in sense of having faculties, 13 faculties altogether, starting with theology and ending up with physics and medicine, and of course business and languages and all what is the Baltic studies. Just talking about, it is also the alma mater and the host organization for 13 research institutes. You see, 13 is somehow very important number right now for the university, not talking about that we have 13,000 students too. So, but they are not evenly distributed, so of course, among all those faculties. And we have 13 research institutes, also starting with the Institute of History of Latvia, Latvian language, then art, literature, art and folklore, and ending up with the Institute of Solid State Physics and the Institute of Atomic Physics and Spectroscopy. So this is really overwhelming field the university covers by these activities, and it is always a challenge to be the member of the university, and it's also especially to be in the administration of the university, because you have to be very versatile and active not only in the academic field but also to be in touch with our governing institutions, with our societies, because in fact we are striving to show the role of the university for our citizens in very versatile fields, and now we are now in challenging process of merger with another university which was mostly dedicated to teaching, education in the teachers' education. And now we shall have not only those institutes and faculties all around Riga, where we are now, but also we shall have 8 branches located in regional cities in Latvia. So we'll be the University of Latvia in full sense of this word now. But nevertheless, the development is going on. We are very much, of course, involved and thankful also to the European contribution to the through the structural funds to the development of infrastructure of study processes of the university. We are now developing a new campus on the other side of the Daugava River next to the National Library, and probably if you shall have time enough, it's worth visiting it to see the first building which is already in place, and then in 3 years or in 12 years when the next conference of Baltic Studies in Europe will be held again in Riga, you shall have already fully flourishing new campus of the university where we shall concentrate our efforts here in Riga, and where we want to see the university as an important engine for the development of our country, of our culture, of our economy, of our society. And I'm sure that this conference, where you are coming, nearly 300 of researchers from very different countries and continents, will be important stimulus for our further development. You will be able to define the new topics for the new research and development programs. You'll find probably much of the interesting theoretical discussions, and probably the already existing contacts which have been in place will be further developed and will help our institutions to strengthen their research positions and to find new approaches towards the interests of our societies which we are serving. So, thank you very much for coming to Riga. I'm very thankful also to the organizers of this conference and all supporters of this conference, and I hope that those days will be not just warm in the sense of weather outdoors, but also very stimulating and interesting for the development of your and our joint research. So thank you very much.
Okay, splendid. And now I would like to invite Ms. Liga Leinga, the State Secretary at the Latvian Ministry of Education and Science.
Honorable Rector, Dr. Matis, dear ladies and gentlemen, on the behalf of the Ministry of Education and Science of Latvia, let me say a few welcoming words to the participants of this conference. Throughout the last century, the Baltic states have experienced many significant events that have shaped the world as we know it now. Many have been especially painful for us since we have been at the very forefront. Nevertheless, whatever the circumstances, we have overcome the pain and loss by being united and persistent. For almost 3 decades now, we have been working on reconnecting the region, removing the barriers that kept us apart from the European Union and the rest of the world. Now, with the global economy at our doorstep, the global education and research area is here as well, and a new task lies ahead. A task to understand not only what we as a region can offer to the world, but also how we can compete in this much more open arena. The 12th Conference on the Baltic Studies in Europe aims to reflect on the past, present, and future of the Baltic states almost a century after their declaration of independence. Throughout the years, the Baltic states have become much more powerful. Powerful in terms of the knowledge we have accumulated and produced. And knowledge is powerful, especially when it is applied. Therefore, my wish to all of us in this conference is to embrace the knowledge of the past, understand the present, and find a way to apply it in the future. A Roman Stoic philosopher, Seneca, has said, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." By addressing this conference, I encourage us not to be frightened by our past, present, or future, but to be certain that we can make this region a better place to live in. Be certain that we can create a truly joint Baltic states education and research area to serve our people the knowledge base in order to be locally embedded but globally connected. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very successful conference.
Thank you. Okay, so now we turn to our keynote address. Our keynote speaker is somebody I think most of us, if not all of us, are familiar with, is Dr. Britta Mattis. She's educated, first of all, in the USA, but defended her PhD in Switzerland. She's been a frontline witness to the changes that the Baltic states have experienced over the last 25 years. She was the first executive director of the Soros Foundation Latvia, and also the key person in setting up this NGO, which to this very day remains the key NGO in Latvia promoting reform, liberal values, openness, transparency, and so on. She's also an academic, lecturing in Europe and in Latvia, where at the moment she has a post as a visiting professor at the Riga Graduate School of Law, and she's written widely academic texts in magazines. She's interviewed both on television and in articles and so on. We met last year at the Democracy Festival, almost exactly a year ago, where she participated in a very interesting and provocative discussion with a member of the clergy and other intellectuals. And today, I hope we can look forward to an equally interesting and provocative speech. And let me just read out the correct title: The Baltics, the Uses and Abuses of Diversity. So I now, adversity. Oops. Okay, and just one technical aside. Unfortunately, we don't have a roaming microphone, we realized a while ago. So what we propose is that questions and discussion we handle over at the museum, where we will be heading off to afterwards, and Dr. Mattis is more than happy to engage in discussion and answer any questions that you may have then. So anyway, Dr. Mattis, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, honored conference participants, aficionados of all things Baltic, first of all, thank you, Professor Auwers, for that very extensive introduction. And thank you, Professor Ikstans, for inviting me. Sitting here, I realized that this event has a bit of added poignancy for me, because I think the last time I attended one of these European Baltic conferences was way back in the early 1980s when they were held in Stockholm, and I was a struggling student in Geneva, Switzerland. And back in those times, the Baltic peoples, be they Lithuanian, Estonian, or Latvian, were very, very thin on the ground in Switzerland. So I was always very excited to be able to go to Stockholm and meet other academics who were interested in my field. So I'm very glad to be here and to participate. Sweet are the uses of adversity, not diversity. So says the exiled duke in Shakespeare's play As You Like It, bequeathing in turn a useful turn of phrase for generations of the afflicted, a phrase that can be taken at face value, but which is often dispensed in an ironic tone. Oh yes, how sweet it is, this adversity of mine. In the Baltics, and more broadly in the Central and East European context, the phrase cut down to simply the uses of adversity, no longer sweet, became very well known in the late 1980s with the publication of Timothy Garton Ash's book entitled The Uses of Adversity, Essays on the Fate of Central Europe. A prescient book if there ever was one. Professor Ash wrote already in 1984 that when the thaw came, the Czech Chartists would be ready, as the Chartists knew from their experience in 1968 how suddenly a society can be transformed. For those of you who are not familiar with this seminal book, permit me to remind you why Timothy Garton Ash chose this Shakespearean phrase, the uses of adversity, as the title of his collection of essays. Firstly, it was the title of one of the main essays in the book concerning Poland, first published in the New York Review of Books in 1985. The idea was adversity, in Poland's case, martial law in the early 1980s, could also be a fertile terrain for creating an adversarial culture, a culture in opposition to the ruling class, for creating a kind of a hero who by example showed his and her countrymen how to live as if you were living in a free country. In a broader sense, the entire book illustrated how adversity and suffering could also foster positive qualities. For instance, a sense of community and the idea of the moral value of culture. Well, these positive qualities quickly disappeared in the early 1990s, as they were hindrances. Time for the cultivation of friendships and community was now dedicated to getting ahead, or just simply staying afloat in the harsh new world of so-called capitalism and privatization, otherwise known as state capture. Culture no longer held a moral value, no longer held even a monetary value. The early 1990s were particularly difficult for those artists and cultural workers, I hate this phrase, but there's no equivalent, who had been a relatively privileged caste in the decades before. In the Baltic region, too, the years of occupation had similar uses. Friendships were cultivated, if only for the reason that without your own little community, your own little clique, your own connections, you would not have access to medicine, to milk, to meat, to basically any deficit item. Culture also held a moral value, perhaps even greater than in the countries that Professor Ash wrote about at the time. For in the Baltics, culture took on an existential hue. Poets not only spoke truth to power, but spoke in a language that was an affront to power. The idea of the moral value of culture, the cultivation of friendship and community, these two positive byproducts of living in a totalitarian or authoritarian state have disappeared today. Difficult to make an argument about the moral value of culture when you see rock group X participate in a TV advertisement inviting voters to cast their ballots for an oligarch-supported political party, when you see writer Y lending her name to another oligarch's pet project, when you note that singer Z is participating in a concert with criminal sponsors. Difficult also to see how the cultivation of friendships can have a positive effect other than in a traditional nomenclatura sense. In a system where success depends on who you know rather than what you know, yes, of course, friendships are useful, but hardly useful to the overall benefit of the state. But the question I would like to posit today is, are there other uses of adversity? Are there other positive byproducts of having lived under an authoritarian regime that could be pertinent today? Pertinent today in a way that they were not in the 1980s or even in the 1990s. That is, in the time before the internet the social media, and facilitated dissemination of information. Is there a use of adversity particular to the Baltic experience that gives the inhabitants of the Baltic region an edge in the current environment of disinformation wars and fake news? When the eminent Estonian writer Jan Kross was asked over a decade ago, what is it that enabled the Estonians to survive throughout history, Kross replied, I quote, "I suppose it is Estonians' cheerful skepticism. By this, I mean that Estonians always doubt the values being offered to them without at the same time being too dramatic about it. It seems to me that this quality is very beautifully worded in the Estonian proverb, 'One's own eye is king.'" Kross goes on to say that another way of putting this is that you propagandists can cackle as much as you wish, but I won't believe you no matter what. I want to see for myself, and after I have seen, I will decide for myself what is right and what is wrong. Kross continues explaining, quote, "In other words, what has saved us is disbelief in the things that the world babbles on to us about. All the foreign powers who have rolled over us have always tried to convince us that they were the best. Had we had a different personality, it would have been so easy to go along with them and to lose ourselves," end of quote. Kross, of course, is talking about the Estonians. Whether this cheerful skepticism applies to Latvians and Lithuanians as well, this could be discussed at length. One concrete case comes to mind where Latvians, compared to the Estonians, were not at all cheerfully skeptical. In 2003, both Estonia and Latvia backed the United States in the Iraq War, as perhaps this was the price to pay for upcoming membership in NATO. Latvian officialdom showed their support slavishly, in my personal opinion, even histrionically, whereas Estonian officialdom was indeed not too dramatic about it. That other nations and peoples are perhaps not so skeptical as the Balts, have not had a history that taught them to be wary, do not have it hardwired in their DNA to discount hyperbole, well, this we knew. But until November of last year, perhaps we did not fully understand the extent to which these qualities could also be a negative as opposed to a positive. After years of hearing how the Balts need to be more optimistic, need to be more trusting, need to be more easygoing, less morose, perhaps now is the time for Balts to give, say, their American friends a few lessons in skepticism. The greatest pancakes in the world, Betty's world-famous hot dogs. When driving through the American countryside, through forlorn little towns, such proclamations, far-fetched as they may be, are the norm. Growing up in America, as I did, they become part of a familiar landscape, and no one seems perturbed in the least by the discrepancy between the fantastic promises and the reality. Put up a similar sign, the greatest pancakes in the world, over a dive in Duobele, and the sign would invoke skepticism at least, smirks and outright laughter at worst. And yes, I know in Duobele they make excellent flour, so perhaps they even do have the world's best pancakes, but the exaggerated claims would not necessarily help them in gaining a clientele. And here, I must say that 2 days ago, when I got off the plane here at Riga Airport, And I was just developing the idea in my head that the Balts, given their history, have a healthy skepticism towards exaggerated claims. What do I see on the wall right in front of me, right before baggage claim, the baggage claim area? Yes, there's this huge, which I'm sure you all saw, this huge poster, the Latvian basketball player and Knicks star Porzingis. That's understandable. But near that is another poster, a blown-up map of Latvia, and underneath, the caption in large block letters says, "Welcome to Big Latvia." Welcome to Big Latvia. Well, the advertisement is sponsored by Citadele, ex-Perex Bank. No further comment. Bank Citadele posters notwithstanding, skepticism towards exaggerated claims, which could otherwise be deemed a lack of trust, is a Baltic trait. In the best scenario, this cheerful skepticism, in the Estonian case, the slightly more sullen variety of skepticism in the Latvian case, and the more devoted brand of skepticism in the Lithuanian case, in the best scenario, this all will lead to a greater scrutiny in the Baltic region of the politics and media coverage being offered. In the worst scenario, the same skepticism will lead to an across-the-board dismissal of all offerings, a belief that nothing can be believed. Democracy is never a thing done. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing. These words of the American writer Archibald MacLeish have never been more true, especially in his native land today. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, however, there was a much more teleological approach to democracy in this region. One spoke of transformation, of reform, of restructuring, all words which implied a move from one fixed system to another. Back then, the picture was a simple one. There were the old, stable democracies who now had come to teach the new fledgling former communist states what democracy was all about. Also what capitalism is all about, but that is another story. Back then, the idea that democracies die, that even old democracies can die, that was not at all in the air. As Professor Auwers pointed out, during the early 1990s, I was the director of a US-based foundation here in Latvia. And I remember an episode that left me feeling distinctly uncomfortable. The setting? A conference room in the Hotel de Rome here around the corner. The foundation is hosting a couple of well-dressed experts from New York who are lecturing a group of invited Latvians. Translation is provided. The experts painstakingly draw stickmen on their flip charts and earnestly explain to the Latvians what is democracy, in terms a kindergartner could understand. As the lecture continued, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable, and I couldn't understand quite why. Was it because I felt these experts were talking down to their Latvian audience, which included several people who had been deported to Siberia, several dissidents, and several artists who all well understood, in real practical terms, what standing up for democracy and freedom could cost? Yes, there was that. But it is much later that I realized that what really bothered me was that these well-dressed, well-paid, and probably well-intentioned Americans, that they could draw excellent theoretical diagrams and stickmen practicing democracy, but that they had never, ever had to make personal sacrifices for democracy themselves. They inherited from previous generations a ready-made and seemingly solid democratic system and had never had to make difficult choices. What bothered me was that they, in the words of Czesław Miłosz, they do not know how one pays. Those abroad do not know. They do not know what one buys and at what price. captive mind. So here too, perhaps, is another case of the usefulness of adversity. In the Baltics and elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, the previous system forced you to make hard and dangerous choices. Do you inform on your neighbor and get the well-paid and well-connected job? Or do you continue your menial, badly paid employment? Do you bribe the nurse at the hospital for better treatment for your husband? Or do you let it, and perhaps him, go? Do you sign the document denouncing your colleague? Or do you refuse to affix your signature? Do you risk imprisonment, or do you play along? These constraints both formed and deformed character. But in either case, one rarely took anything for granted. I wonder where these two American experts, so adept at drawing stickmen on flip charts, are today. Perhaps working in Washington, D.C.? If so, how will they react if confronted not with the theoretical case of democracy, but a situation where a personal hard choice needs to be made, say, take the job in an administration which spurns many of the basic tenets of democracy, or turn the job down and not be able to afford to send your daughter to her exclusive, expensive private school of choice? Finding oneself low on the totem pole of affluence, is Siberia enough for all too many in the US today? The next year or so will show how free the American people truly are and how deeply democracy is entrenched in the country. There are encouraging signs, and over 200 years of history of doing democracy in the nation, of tending this fragile plant. Americans may have lost the reflex of doing democracy out of a lack of necessity. The Balts, on the other hand, still, far too often, think that the doing should be done by others. So, cheerful skepticism and the experience of making hard choices under pressure. These are two of the possible uses of adversity for Baltic people today. Let me add a third and final one, which, however, more often resembles an abuse rather than a use. No less an authority than Nobel Prize winner and poet Czesław Miłosz admits that in 1989 he very much hoped and believed that the dramatic experiences of the previous 45 years would create an antitoxin that would immunize the Poles against the desire, as he put it, I quote, to seize unselectively on all the idiocies coming from the West, unquote. Soon after, he acknowledged that he no longer had such a hope and said, I see very little sign of the awareness that suffering should bring. Among these idiocies, one could include the excessive materialism of the West. George Steiner, professor at the University of Geneva, makes the same point, but in a more nuanced way, decrying the, quote, conspicuous consumption and uniformities of the American and Asian models, unquote, and heralds certain European ideals of leisure and privacy, even going so far as to say that Europe will generate a counter-industrial revolution even as it generated the industrial revolutions itself. George Steiner, too, has an idealized view of the years of adversity in Eastern and Central Europe, saying that, quote, those who knew Eastern Europe during the bleak decades, or Britain in austerity, will know what human solidarities and creativities can derive from relative poverty. It is not political censorship that kills, it is the despotism of the mass market and the rewards of commercialized stardom, end of quote. Needless to say, Steiner lived for very, very many years in Switzerland and not at all in Eastern and Central Europe. Well, the creativities that derived from relative poverty quickly lost their appeal in Eastern Europe, and the allure of Prada, Hugo Boss, and vacations, first in the Canary Islands, later in the Seychelles, replaced any need for human solidarity. Suffering, which should have created deeper understanding of the difference between vital values and moral values, between vital values which tell you that saving your own life and enhancing your own well-being is what matters most of all, and moral values which tell you that staying human is more important than staying alive. This suffering seems to have created no such deeper understanding, but to have created a compensatory drive instead. Amass what you can, while you can, however you can, for who knows what the morrow will bring. This was certainly true in the Baltics. Was it true in Russia as well? Among the upper echelons, definitely yes. Go into any luxury shop in Paris, Milan, or London, and Russian will be heard. But interestingly enough, in Svetlana Alexeyevich's recent book of interviews, Secondhand Time, she, or her interviewees, seem to imply that the Russian people are an exception to this rule. That Russians, quote, need the kind of idea that gives them goosebumps and makes their spines tingle. That Russians don't want to just live, they want to live for something. They want to participate in some great undertaking. You'll sooner find a saint here than an honest and successful man. Read the Russian classics. Continuing that, Russians' people's happiness has never had anything to do with money. That's the difference between the Russian idea and the American dream. These are all Alexeyevich's interviewees talking. This capacity to mobilize for some great undertaking as opposed to the daily tending and doing of democracy, yes, Russia has proved itself in this sense many times over. What these quotes from Alexeyevich's book imply, it seems, is that for Russians, there have also been uses of adversity. In the clash between moral values and vital values, moral values, in a peculiarly Russian interpretation, seem to have precedence, at least in a certain milieu. Vital values, survival at any cost, enhancing one's well-being, are prevalent at one level of society, moral values at another, and the former know very well how to manipulate the latter to their benefit. Is there a level of society in the Baltic region which gives similar precedence to moral values, to the principle that an idea, be it democracy, the nation, or liberty, is more important than staying alive? That remaining human is more important than staying alive? Probably, yes, but nowhere near in as great as numbers as in Russia, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Adversity and penury in both the Baltic and Russian cases created a certain attitude towards material goods and personal well-being after 1991. If the interviewees in Alexeyevich's book are to be taken at face value, these attitudes, for the large majority of the respective Baltic and Russian populations, are different. The consequences of this difference, if such a difference indeed exists, needs to be considered. The premise of the idea of the uses of adversity is based on the fact that a group of people or an individual have indeed undergone adversity. In the Baltic region, at least one generation has emerged which has no personal memory of adversity. Thus, the habit of cheerful skepticism, the familiarity of dealing with hard choices, and the priority given to moral values over vital values, these habits become more and more attenuated. The title of this conference is Baltic States at 99, Past, Present, and Future. Let's not forget that in 1941, when the Baltic states were a mere 23 years old, there were only about a dozen democracies left on the planet. the failures of democracy, moral, political, economic, and other, had created a momentum in favor of totalitarianism. It can happen again. Let us not forget that democracy in its present form is only slightly over 200 years old. That is a flash in the pan. In a totalitarian or even authoritarian regime, not only might makes right, might also makes truth. The existence of an autonomous truth based on facts, based on principles, is not admissible, for this truth represents an island of independence over which the powers that be have no control. That is why truth is so dangerous to those who seek control. In totalitarian states, a particular code is widespread. Those who know do not talk. Those who do not know do not ask questions. And those who do ask questions receive no answers. In this way, a simple citizen can defend his or her ignorance. Truth on its own does not prevail. Truth, when it clashes with power, it often loses. Truth prevails only when people are willing and strong enough to defend it. Nazi persecution did not take extreme forms in the beginning. It progressed only insofar as it met with no resistance. The Baltic peoples know about resistance. They also know about complex stories. In order to resist the lure of those who offer simple solutions, one needs to understand and accept complexity. For their 100th birthday, one can wish for the Baltic peoples the will and capacity to resist the lure of simple solutions. One wishes for them the preservation of their skepticism, cheerful or otherwise, which does not degrade into overall nihilism. One can wish for them a sense of the long term, where moral values take precedence over vital values. One can wish that they continue to understand that democracy and freedom will always be about hard choices, that they never be conceived as a free ride. Most of all, for their 100th birthday, one wishes for the Baltic states a completely different epigram than the one given to Russia in Alexeyevich's second-hand time. That epigram is, in 5 years, everything can change in Russia, but in 200, nothing, says one of Alexeyevich's interviewees. For the Baltic states, let us wish them a completely different trajectory. That is, in the Baltic states, not much can change in 5 years, but in 100, everything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mattis. I think you can expect lots of questions and discussion. Before we start gradually making our way from here, there are 2 housekeeping issues I've been asked to bring up. So the first one is that we're a largely paperless conference, so all the information you need is on here, including, it turns out, the map for how to get to the National Art Gallery. So for those of you not familiar with how to get there, our assistants, our conference assistants downstairs, beginning in about 15 or 20 minutes, they'll be taking groups of people across the parks and to the National Gallery, where our opening reception event kicks off around 6-ish. So that's the first thing. If you're not sure how to get there, if you go downstairs to the vestibule, then in about 15 or 20 minutes, our guides will start taking you over there. The second thing is something that I hope you're all aware of. The conference sessions won't be taking place here in this building, but they will be at the Faculty of Social Sciences. Okay, so don't come here tomorrow looking for the sessions, unless you are traveling by the delights of public transport to the Faculty of Social Sciences, in which case, over there, on the side street by the University of Latvia, so when you're facing the park, the road to the right, that is the stop for the number 15 trolley bus, which will give you an exhilarating experience of Riga. The number 15 trolley bus, which will take you in about 15 minutes or so to the Faculty of Social Sciences. The stop you need is Lomonosova. When you get there, get out of the trolley bus, go back in the direction you were coming, about 20 yards, cross the road, and the faculty is right there. Okay, and so that's where all the plenary sessions will, all the panels and discussions will be taking place on Tuesday and Wednesday. A cab will cost you about €5 to get out there. But the number 15 is an interesting experience you should enjoy while in Riga. Otherwise, we'll see you in about an hour's time at the National Gallery of Art, and we'll continue our discussions then. Thank you.